So I'd like to invite first Barry and then David to, who don't need any introduction here,
that Brian did such a good job on reminiscence. Excellent. I was one of the original staff appointed by David Edge, and I got the job by an extraordinary piece of luck, quite extraordinary, and also good luck as it turned out. As it turned out through the help of an enormous number of people at the place and around the place when I arrived. And I really need to mention all these people today. There are a lot of them present here. Thanks for a great start to a fortunate career. And among the people not here, of course, I've got to specially mention David Edge, who ended up appointing me. And I completely agree with everything that Brian said about David and his role. And if anything, he's underestimated the importance of David, and he was all important, particularly in the early years when we didn't know what we were doing and we were learning what we were supposed to do. It was a field that didn't exist that we were teaching. Try it. But despite all this, I left the unit 25 years ago, half the time of this 50 years. And my memory these days is very unreliable indeed. And that's why I'm pleased David did such a good job, because I'm not going to reminisce today. I don't trust myself. And instead, I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to say a few words about anniversaries themselves and a couple of examples of them. Now then, there's an immense enthusiasm for anniversaries today. Even centenaries are always ongoing somewhere. And rightly or wrongly in science, it's always research that's the focus of anniversaries, as with one we've been reminded of just half an hour or so ago, the centenary of Einstein and general relativity last year. But the most widely celebrated recent example in science of an anniversary was probably Darwin year, which marked the bicentenary of Darwin's birth in 1809 and the publication of The Origins of Species 50 years later. Now, both man and book have long been studied by legions of historians, and this work did indeed figure to some extent in the events. But also prominent were discussions of present-day knowledge in fields claiming Darwin as ancestor, and back projections of present-day knowledge into accounts of Darwin and his time. Basically, in 2009, selected varieties of present-day knowledge were celebrated in ways mindful of the future standing of the institutions that carried them. And this hints at an explanation of why today's obsessively forward-looking societies are replete with anniversaries. We don't just honour past achievements on these occasions, we come together to invent the future. That's why I'm discussing anniversaries now. I want to turn our attention from the past to the future. In my interest, as I've forgotten one, and I'm on safe ground with everyone else on the other. Well, individuals are frequently the foci for future-oriented gatherings, and part of the reason Darwin serves so well is that he's sufficiently distant from us. Ideally, institutionally important celebrations should begin with a centenary. A mere 50 years is too close to the span of an adult life and invites tension between continuing institutions and the biologically generated individuals enacting them who require periodic replacement. For institutions, it can be difficult to create functional histories of living people with their own diverse agendas. For living individuals, detachment from institutions can be very difficult to cope with, although the problem's understated in the way that I've put it. since you can't draw a clear line between individuals and institutions. You can't do it. If you're interested in this last problem, take a look at the film of The Tragedy of King Richard II, currently on iPlayer, following the commemoration of Shakespeare's death 4 centuries ago. Initially all-powerful, Richard is captured, slowly stripped of all the appurtenances of kingship and the honour it carries, and then murdered. The playwright makes him both the narrator and the analyst of the appalling transformation he endures, and chief mourner at the death of his own institutional self. Not much is left to murder at the end. Richard exemplifies a universal feature of the human condition, although it needs an update for present-day use. Barack Obama is currently satirizing his own imminent retirement. Immensely funny stuff, well worth looking at. Exploiting his remarkable gift for comedy. And it's clear that a lot of Barack Obama's going to be left when he leaves the White House. As for scientists, they differ from rulers, ancient and modern, in how they relate to institutions. Scientists constantly shed knowledge into specialized collectives and gain thereby a status security that can weaken their links to institutions in the large. The mathematician Gregory Perelman is an extreme example. In 2003, he casually published a proof of Poincaré's conjecture on the internet and subsequently declined $1 million prize and a Fields Medal. Perelman was 52 years ago. I do apologize. Perelman was 52 days ago. Just in the nick of time for my remark. Perelman ought to be commemorated for his fierce resistance to commemoration. Now, of course, Perelman was a one-off, a heroic one-off. Others have been in his position and behaved differently. The discovery of the helical structure of DNA in 1953 and the advent of molecular biology were widely commemorated 50 years later in 2003. I do remember vaguely an event in Berlin where some senior scientists were present who'd been active at the time. They didn't agree with the standard historical accounts then on offer, but they didn't agree with each other either and happily argued about what had really happened. They argued about both the past and the likely future of molecular biology. But it was an obvious side issue for them, not worth a fuss, okay for coffee table conversation. One of them remarked that molecular biology had never been more than a letterhead on grant applications. Well, I ought to make clear at this point what my personal attitudes to these anniversaries are. The Darwin Bicentenary was a successful celebration wherein lots of highly functional things were said. A trusted formula was widely followed, long used by theologians and clerics, wherein the past was revised and re-presented. Some would say that's how it has to be at outward-facing events that seek to keep publics on side. But it's definitely not my cup of tea. In contrast, an event in Berlin linked to a 50th anniversary found me enjoying diversity of opinion, concern for what had really happened, and a confidence that the future could take care of itself, much of which emanated from people who'd been there at the time and wouldn't be around much longer. Recalling this now, I've got to admit that hasty celebrations have their plus points, just as centenaries can have a downside. Even so, it remains the case that celebrations after a mere 50 years involve risks, including the risk of getting a ghost at the feast like me. You wouldn't have to worry about me if this was a centenary. But why worry about ghosts anyway? In truth, there are very many reasons for worrying about ghosts, but I'll only mention one of them, and it's far from being the most important. Those who've been involved in building something tend to know it in detail and know its weaknesses. Its weaknesses may even be what they've done most of their research on. They can even develop a secret affection for the flaws and gaps and insecure inferences and so forth they've lived with over the years, and feel uneasy about accounts light on detail which airbrush them all out. I guess I've got to be a bit like this somehow. At gatherings like today's, I get an inexplicable urge to tell it like it is. And although untimely truths aren't appropriate at funerals, this is a gala, not a funeral today. And so I'll say what I fancy. And whatever telling it like it is means, in general, today it means my calling for caution when describing the achievement of the Science Studies unit and resisting suggestions of how profoundly it has transformed our understanding and so on and so forth. Now, in no way do I want to deny that the unit was highly innovative and productive, and that all involved in it deserve recognition for what it did. But looking around, it seems to me that the change in understanding that people associate with it has actually yet to happen. And there's everything still to do. The unit helped to start something. Brian said so just now. I was very pleased he ended by saying that. What it did was to help to start something, and other people helped as well. And to acknowledge this is very important, or at least to me today, because it raises the question of what's going to happen to that something. Although, let me emphasize that I don't see this as being a question for me. For my generation, there's no knowing what will happen, and no point in guessing, although I guess that shouldn't trouble us. An uncertain future confronts human beings everywhere, and for those in our line of work, there's ample compensation of a kind not everybody has. In contributing to knowledge, we ensure that the effects of what we do spread well beyond their source and become 100 times more difficult to eradicate because of that, even though we can know little of what the effects will be in the longer term, and nobody may then know who we were. It's a good deal. Well, it is, unless you fancy having your 600th birthday remembered instead, like Richard II's next year. And it's a deal offered anew to every succeeding generation. An ever-changing epistemic inheritance awaits every newcomer for use in making her own contribution to an endless task. That's if you work in research. As to Edinburgh itself, it's obvious that, like most everywhere, things have changed radically since the early days of the unit, and that not every change has been an improvement. Universities are now top-heavy with bureaucracy, and highly pressured researchers have to consider ever more carefully what letterhead to use on their grant applications. But outstanding work continues to be done here, and that's what really matters. It means that a plethora of models, methods, skills and accomplishments, instruments and artifacts, and not least, opportunities for rewarding interaction, is available to those who come here. How should I know? But Edinburgh still seems a good place to be young. I wish all of you still active here good fortune. It's not my future now, it's yours.
In celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Science Studies unit, the founder members of the unit are perhaps entitled to feel slightly cosmic. let me grant myself the permission to be cosmic and then exploit it to the full. I want to relate the methodology used by sociologists of science to the wisdom of the Old Testament. I speak as an old-fashioned atheist, but I want to suggest that the book of Ecclesiastes has something to say to us. The book of Ecclesiastes is about human knowledge and the human condition. The mysterious, unknown author who speaks in the book advanced the famous doctrine that there is nothing new under the sun. All is vanity, he said, and the wise man and the fool suffer the same fate. There are moving lines expressing the thought that there is a time for everything. A time for living and a time for dying, a time for building up and a time for knocking down, a time for peace and a time for war. What has this got to do with the sociology of science? The link, of course, is with relativism. Relativists deny that the human mind can grasp any absolute truth. And this is the theme explored in Ecclesiastes. Let me take a few moments to say something about relativism, and I will then exploit the link with Ecclesiastes. The correct way to form the relativist stance has long been a matter of controversy. For better or worse, members of the unit have been drawn into this controversy. Some critics even speak of Edinburgh relativism, and they obviously find it repugnant. The repugnance may go some way to explain why the relativist position is widely misunderstood and widely misrepresented. So what is needed is a clear account of the necessary and sufficient conditions that must be satisfied if imputations of relativism are to be made correctly and accurately. Start with the necessary conditions. Philosophical critics have said that if you are a relativist, you are committed to what they call the equal validity thesis. Stated simply, the equal validity thesis implies that, say, the physics of Aristotle is as good as the physics of Einstein. This, say the critics, is obviously wrong, but it is surely what relativism implies. It is an unavoidable part of relativism, they say. It is a necessary condition. The critics who make this accusation ignore the fact that there are many local and practical reasons embedded in local and practical circumstances that might sustain a preference for, say, Einstein over Aristotle. The grounds for such a preference can be real, but non-absolute. There can be relative grounds for attributing different rather than equal validity to different claims to knowledge. It is therefore an error on the critic's part to stipulate that the equal validity thesis is a necessary part of relativism. No doubt some people who call themselves relativists embrace the equal validity thesis. The foolish are always with us. But no relativist is compelled to make this step. If the equal validity thesis is not a necessary condition, is it a sufficient condition? In plain English, if someone were to embrace the equal validity thesis, would this allow us to infer that he or she must be a relativist? The inference seems plausible, but this is where the book of Ecclesiastes comes into the story. Ecclesiastes provides a counterexample to the inference. The counterexample shows that it is invalid to infer that someone is a relativist just because they accept equal validity. Here is the counterexample. Recall the doctrine that there is nothing new under the sun, and that all is vanity, and the fool and the wise man are as one. Aristotle was no fool, but if there really is nothing new under the sun, then there can be nothing new in Einstein. If all is vanity, then the claims of Einstein are as vain as those of Aristotle, and will soon seem equally quaint. We can therefore see that the author of Ecclesiastes is expressing a dramatic form of the equal validity thesis. Indeed, he gave what is perhaps the only version of the thesis that should command a moment's respect. So the first thing to notice is that Ecclesiastes actually asserted the equal validity thesis. The second thing to notice is that he did so as an expression of absolutism. The God of the Judeo-Christian tradition is an absolute God. Whether we realize it or not, for most of us in science studies, it is this tradition that provides us with a very archetype of what it is to be absolute. It is what gives meaning to the word. The converse also holds. This tradition gives meaning to what it is to reject absolutes. Indirectly, it gives meaning to relativism too. Putting these two parts of the counterexample together, we can see that the author of the book of Ecclesiastes was an absolutist who accepted the equal validity thesis and offered absolutist grounds for doing so. Compared to the infinite and absolute character of God's wisdom, all human knowledge pales into utter insignificance. This shows that there is no unique relation between relativism and the equal validity thesis. The thesis can also be an expression of an absolutist conception of knowledge. The equal validity thesis is therefore neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for the correct imputation of relativism. The critics of relativism are barking up the wrong tree. They understand neither relativism nor absolutism. Let me end by going back to the more familiar side of Ecclesiastes, to the long list that follows the assertion that there is a time for living and a time for dying. There is one thing that the Old Testament writer omitted to mention in his list. He failed to note that there is a time for creating small interdisciplinary academic departments and a time for abolishing them. No doubt he would have added this to his list if he had thought of it. And of course, he would be right to do so. Everything has its time. The unit's members have made their contribution. Mindful of Ecclesiastes, perhaps that is all that should be said and all that needs to be said.